My name is Michael Dear, and I want to welcome you to this evening called Fiat Lux. We are very delighted to be here, and we are here thanks to the work of a large number of people, most impressively Kristina Huang and Mary, who's at the back, and Joe, and too many other people to mention, but I will mention Jason Miller, because the images that you're looking at, he stole from Ansel Adams' collection, and we've been looking at them to put us in the mood for this conversation about Fiat Lux. The occasion of Fiat Lux is this big black book that's flying around that was produced originally in 1968 with photographs by Ansel Adams, an up-and-coming photographer, and Nancy Newhall. 1968 was, of course, important. All of us remember it. It was a time of global student uprising, and the book was really a celebration of what was a global achievement, which was the creation of the University of California system. I don't think there's any exaggeration on my part to make that claim forward. It was a stunning achievement, and it remains a stunning achievement, however much it's threatened, or at least as we see it being threatened now. The creation of the University of California system is something that we're all proud of and should continue to be so. It's also, however, a snapshot in time. And if you haven't looked at the images, I really encourage you to do so. There's a companion exhibition put on by Catherine Cole. Is Catherine here? No, she should be here. She's a heroine of the campus because of the work that she's been doing on this project called On the Same Page. You see, all incoming graduates, undergraduates, got the Fiat Lux book this year, which is a facsimile of the original 1968 edition, so that they could actually have a conversation about a common theme, the University of California. And I really like the book because of what it tells us about the time. It's a snapshot of optimism, looking ahead to social change, a promise of a future, but it's also really a past era with all these men in, I was about to say these older men in black suits, but standing around. I'm not doing this, but they're sitting in front of trays full of dead birds, and this is the promise of science. It's actually a remarkable document from that point of view. So we're joining this common conversation tonight at CED, and this is our version of Fiat Lux. Now, I want to mention just one word of warning. Fiat Lux means, of course, make light or shine light or something like that if you're prepared to relax the Latin a little bit. But my emails with people over the last few weeks have created this firestorm of Latin revival on the CED. So, you know, we've had Fiat Lux, which of course my favorite was Fiat Risus, which is like make laughter. Christina Hill said Fiat Panis, which is like make bread, make food, which tells you where her priorities are, I suppose. And yet, we were thinking about dinner, yes. Fiat Ursus, of course, is also something that you all should know, which roughly translates as go bears. Make bears, go, that doesn't, but I'm warning you about this because if you want to join this Latinate fiesta of exchanges on the email, the FBI has actually been attracted by all this attention in Latin that's coming out of the CED. And so if you want to join in, I'd be very careful about what you're saying there. And please, you know, I'm not going to post any beefcake pictures of me up there. It'll be pretty awe-inspiring. But you might want to sort of hold back on the beefcake pictures too. On the other hand, you know, if it gets me on the Daily Show with Jon Stewart, I probably will post the beefcake pictures. I just warn you that if you start talking in Latin on the CED internet right now, you are likely to be investigated by the FBI, and you know where that gets people into all sorts of trouble. So, but tonight, all joking aside, folks, we want to talk about Fiat Lux. The format of the evening is we start off with a real star of the department, Sam Davis. He's a star in lots of ways because he actually remembers being at Berkeley at that time. And so he has a very special viewpoint that he's going to talk to us about, and basically looking a little bit toward the past in Berkeley, but also bringing us up to date. That's going to be followed by Janet Delaney, who is an artist and a lecturer in the college, who's going to talk about the photography of Ansel Adams. And I know this is going to be really interesting. I've chatted to her already about it. She really knows Ansel Adams, and her insights into photography are really worthwhile. So those two people are going to anchor the performance, in a sense, with 15-minute presentations on the past and the photography. And then the younger bloods enter the array, because what I've done then is we've got a little round table moderated by Ananya Roy, because I know that she'll keep good order amongst the panel. But the newer or younger faculty, the people who have just come here, I've deliberately tried to put the older people on one side here, because I basically know what they think. I don't know what these other guys think. And I think that might make for an interesting discussion, looking more toward the future of the University of California. I've suggested to the people involved in this conversation that they don't worry too much about how tough things have been over the last little while, and we could spend the entire evening in a lugubrious festival of mourning and groaning. We won't do that. We will be constructively looking ahead for our own entertainment and edification. So, no hand-wringing, either from the panel or from the audience. This is not an upbeat, silly moment, not a Pollyanna-ish moment, but I'd like to stay out of the depths of gloom if we can. Then, to the extent that there's time, we will have a Q&A from the audience. I will moderate that, but I'm otherwise going to keep out of the way, and around 7 o'clock, we will be complete. We're already 10 minutes behind. I'm warning you that you're being videotaped. So again, watch what you do, please. So with that in mind, we're ready to go, and I'm going to invite Sam Davis, Professor Emeritus of Architecture in the college, to come and begin the conversation. Thank you, Sam.
Well, Michael asked that I begin this session, as he said, and I gather my qualifications are that I'm the oldest person he could find that's still standing, that's not slobbering on himself, that might have something to say about the 48 years I've been here. I was indeed here shortly after the founding of CED, and during the period of time of the book Fiat Lux. And I don't remember everything, believe me. So my early experience here is definitely circumscribed by my status as an undergraduate student. I feel a little bit like I started in the mailroom and worked my way up to dean and then out the door. I'm going to do this in 3 parts. I'm going to talk about Cal in general, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the college and something about the architecture. And I probably will not take my full allotment. So I arrived in the fall of '64. I was the first cohort of students to enter this building. It was the fall of the free speech movement, but the free speech movement, as Michael alluded, was just one of many social movements of the time, or episodes or passions. You cannot think of Berkeley in the '60s or the '70s as being separate from what was happening all around the country. Now, obviously, Berkeley was out in front, as it has been so often. But these were turbulent times in many places, and not just here. Again, the free speech movement, Vietnam War, the women's movement, the environmental movement, the Black Power and the Black Panthers. Music had a great evolution or revolution. Drugs, the summer before this book was published was the summer of love in San Francisco. And a general questioning and pushing back against authority. Now, a time of growth and discovery is always exciting. It's establishing your identity, and it's much more exciting than a time of retraction and reconsideration and survival, which I'm not allowed to get into. At that time, or in a time of this sort, discussion, debate, deliberation are not limited because of resources, in that we didn't have to choose from one thing to another, but quite the opposite. All things seemed possible, and all things were worthy of discussion. Now, a revisionist history of this time could say that this was a case of ample funding, but that's not the only thing. You know, that my mother was fond of saying that money is a good deodorant, And there were plenty of smelly problems to go around, and money did make it smell less bad. But I don't think that was the case. I really do think that, yes, there were many unpleasant problems, but there was an unwavering sense that this university was the place to address them. And in that, we held the public trust. That these social movements seemed more acute at Berkeley was not only because this was a grand experiment, as Michael said, but also because it attracted an amazing group of independent-minded and experimental people. In the early 50s, 15 years before this book, during the communist witch hunts, all UC faculty were compelled to sign a loyalty oath. 30 tenured faculty in the UC campuses refused to do this, and they were fired. They were later reinstated when the Supreme Court of the state of California said the oath was unconstitutional. Among those who refused to sign was David Saxon, who later became president of the university. Among those who refused to sign on the Berkeley campus was Charles Muscatine, the professor of English, who later, when he was rehired, and by the way, when Charles was fired, his colleagues who did sign supported him in his lack of employment during that period of time. When Charles came back, he espoused many of the ideas which we currently hold in high esteem, including interdisciplinary study. He began with a few others, something called Strawberry Creek College, which was one of many experiments going on the campus at that time. Now, Strawberry Creek College was really a way to make a big university small, in that about 20 or 30 entering freshmen went to school together through their 4 years and were taught by a cohort of faculty from different departments. And so they were in the college, so to speak. And I had many colleagues here on campus, fellow students that were in it, and thought it was an incredible way to get educated in a big school. He also asked that graduate students start sponsoring their own courses, and that's something we still do even today. Now, that this kind of thing that went on in the 60s and 70s railed against conservative forces was partially motivated by and enhanced by these liberal, independent-minded people. But it was also a reaction to the government of the time. Ronald Reagan began his political career by pushing against the university. And finally, as governor, he began to dismantle the process or erode the process of what we called the free university education. But the people in the legislature had our back. In the fall of 1964, I paid approximately $250 a quarter, and I was an out-of-state student. And that's an equivalent yearly sum of about $5,400, which is approximately half of what we pay now. So it really was the great deal. Now, Fiat Lux pointed out the origins of the UC campuses, or at least Berkeley in any way, and Berkeley particularly, as being mining and agriculture. The university was seen as integral to the economic well-being of the state. But it was through the insistence of its early leaders that the humanities, the arts, and the social sciences were also included. The problems of post-World War II expansion, and particularly expansion of all of the soldiers coming back on the GI Bill and entering into college, and all the attendant environmental concerns of that kind of growth were yet another force that a number of campuses began to address. With this expansion came the problems of water resources, diminishing open space, transportation, pollution of various kinds. Now, these were clearly the domain of CED. In fact, some of the founders of this college were already involved in their own way. They had formed a group called Telesis in San Francisco, where professionals from different disciplines met on a regular basis to discuss how to approach design with an interdisciplinary manner. Many of them, like Vernon DeMars, had worked in what is now known as social housing, or what then was known as social housing. We call it affordable housing, and he had worked through the Farm Securities Administration. Now, Catherine Bauer, later to become Catherine Bauer Wurster, also had a major influence in two ways: social research and housing. She introduced the notion that social science research could actually help architects make more meaningful and appropriate buildings. She was also a major force on the political side, something that architects really didn't know much about or how to deal with, by drafting the at that time, the current National Housing Act. So housing was not seen as just a design problem. It was a social problem, an equity issue, and a topic worthy of research in the university. Housing addressed issues critical to California in the post-World War II era. And to do this, it combined many disciplines. At the creation of CED, most of those involved, Bauer notwithstanding, were design professionals. That was the nature of the curriculum well into the 1960s. When I joined the faculty in 1971, 2/3 of those on the faculty were architects in practice, making buildings. We didn't even teach engineering here in this school. That was taught for us by the School of Engineering. Architects taught building science, such as it was, and we had very few other professionals that were teaching any of the ancillary topics that we now teach. By the 1980s, that figure had reversed. A similar evolution had happened in the other two departments. Many in the original CRP department were physical planners, later to become the minority as scholars in policy, economics, community development, and transportation became more prominent. Most in landscape architecture were design professionals, as that department had begun as a garden design and floriculture, and now has strengths in ecology, land restoration, and social equity. There were several reasons for this, including the influence of Catherine Bauer-Wurster. While UC, and Berkeley in particular, grew up as a science and engineering university, or as an institution, once it became a universal educational institution like Oxford or Harvard, the professional schools became anomalies. In the design field, the questions were, what is our discipline? What is our research? What is our academic standard relative to the other fields on campus? How do we measure up? This questioning also fed into the move away from the Beaux-Arts era, which was what we began as a college, and toward a modernist approach, much more like the Bauhaus. Non-architects with wide worldviews, like Charles Eames and James Prestini, were brought here to reconfigure our curriculum. Later, those architects with cross-disciplinary outlooks began to attract research grants at the federal level in all departments, and we began PhD programs. Social and behavioral factors, increased history offerings, building science and theory all took hold. Practicing architects became the minority. It was also around this time that we switched from a 5-year professional undergraduate degree in landscape and in architecture to the 4+2 degree. We wanted to be more like law and medicine and the other professional schools that emphasize a more learned undergraduate education before encountering a professional curricula. The architecture curriculum, under then Chair Jerry McHugh, took on a grid-like format. The areas were arrayed across the top and the classes in a line down below. Each student was expected to go across and then dig down into an area. Now, it looked very logical. If nothing else, Jerry McHugh was a very logical guy, way before computers. The problem is that each of these rows in itself became a silo, and it was the student that was expected to make the connections. It became known as the cafeteria without the nutritionist. As budgets tightened, what was meant to be interdisciplinary really became multidisciplinary. Today, there are silos throughout the campus, and there remain those here in CED. We may be physically together, but we're not always necessarily collaborative. Fiat Lux clearly shows that this was not the original intent of the campus or the university. Finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about buildings, because buildings reflect our times. The original master plan of the Berkeley campus was executed by John Galen Howard, and many of his buildings were clearly of the Beaux-Arts period, and they were, as that was being taught at the campus at the time. The campus was new and had to establish a sense of gravitas in the eyes of the public. So along his grand ceremonial axis, he put robust symbols: Hearst Mining, Hearst Gym, Doe Library, Greek Theater. These set the tone, both metaphorically and literally, as all buildings from that point forward had to have red tile roofs. The late 50s and 60s began to change that. The 3 sets of dorms were built in the late 50s and early 60s, were modernist set pieces. Then came the unfortunate other buildings: Barrows, University Hall, Tolman, and later Evans. One would like to think that the campus was trying to make itself over as a modern university, a modern institution with modern ideas and designs. Another view is that expedience, driven by rapid growth and a sense that we should not lavish public money on public works, is much more likely. Wurster Hall was different. It really was about ideas, about structure, about program, about the learning experience, about the setting within a campus. Other campuses similarly suffered, but with one exception in my view, and that was Santa Cruz. Its college structure was reinforced by an architecture with different high-profile firms, providing a particular and individual environment for each. Joe Esherick, Charles Moore, Ernest Kump, Hugh Stubbins, and Jerry McHugh all designed separate colleges within the plan by John Carl Warnecke. In my view, this was a return to the notion that design was integral to the educational mission. The Berkeley campus was the first to have a design review process, one that is now mandatory on all the campuses. Since that time, there have been many missteps. And I believe campus architecture at Berkeley and on other campuses now, however, reflect that the mission and ambitions of the university are something to be part of the building program. One only has to visit the new Asian library to see what is possible. Fiat Lux is a snapshot, a point of time in history. It shows what was, but it also shows what was meant to be the ambitions of a great institution. I have had the privilege not just of being part of it, but being the recipient. I revel in its history while I worry about its future.
Thank you, Sam. Lovely story. And now I'm going to invite Janet Delaney to come and talk about the photography, please.
I'm happy to be back on the campus. I teach photography here. I've been involved in photography in many capacities all my life. I was honored to be invited as a spokesperson for my medium, which I'm quite devoted to. I'm sure if Ansel Adams knew that I had taken screenshots off of Xeroxes that were sent to me online in order to represent his work and then to show it, through a projector, it wouldn't really necessarily do it its full service. So I wanted to give him a good chance. This image of Ansel Adams is one that really shows him at work in his absolute favorite milieu, Yosemite. It's how we almost always associate Ansel Adams as the absolute consummate photographer of the natural environment. His work was published extensively, and he is seen as the godfather of the environmentalist movement. I was first introduced to his work at a lecture given at a brand new community college, Cerrito College, in 1969. I was 17, and I was immediately very skeptical. I grew up in Compton, not far from Cerrito College, and I had never seen anything so beautiful, so I was immediately suspicious of this work. I went on to study photography in San Francisco, and I became quite skilled at all the secrets of the zone system, the way he invented to work with the materials in order to exploit them fully. He had a way of transforming reality into an altered state of visual bliss. But beyond the technical wizardry, I learned the language of photography. I learned how photographs speak and how they interpret and how they can also hide the truth. Adams was actually very much a commercial photographer. Though we think of him hiking in the Yosemite with his mule for weeks at a time, the rest of the year, for 40 years, he spent as a commercial photographer. So here's the St. Francis Hotel with its patent leather bar, a commercial architectural job that he had in 1939. When he took on the project of Fiat Lux, the assignment was likely his biggest to date. This comprehensive report took 3 years. He and the writer Nancy Newhall traveled the whole state. He made over 6,000 negatives and ultimately 1,700 prints. I'm sure he enjoyed some of the assigned locations. You'll see throughout the book photographs that he actually used in his own body of work that he was clearly doing on assignment. And as a commercial photographer working for the university, he had to come up with some interesting concepts to convey. I did actually know, I researched this out a bit, and this picture's incredibly cropped. It isn't a surrealistic throwback for him, but actually the whole horse appears in the original. So just note to self, okay? So he had people to acknowledge, ideas to convey, and places that he had to identify with grand shots, with identifying locations for each of the universities, iconic Riverside. And ultimately, if you look at what he was attempting to do, I would say it was really an annual report, perhaps for a factory, a celebration of school as factory of knowledge. Many of his images are seen as being delightful in their composition, their use of light, and his ability to turn almost anything into a thing of beauty, including the LA freeway system. But when you look at the way Nancy Newhall positioned herself in the story of California in the introduction of the book, you can look at this picture perhaps from another point of view. Traffic snarling the highways became unmanageable. Freeways began slicing through canyons and along the shores, and new industries multiplied. Smog from the automobiles and the industries not only choked the cities, darkening the light and obscuring the distances, but drifting through the mountain passes killed crops and in the inland valley and damaged even the alpine forest. So Nancy and Ansel had been working in the environmental movement for many years before they took this on, and so they immediately took hold of the idea of California in the 60s and some of its problems and used that as its introduction to posit what could the university do in response to this. Now I look at this freeway, and, well, while the traffic doesn't look all that bad, and even in the context of this very damning content, it's still beautiful, which is kind of Ansel Adams' thing. So he had to depict a place that wasn't yet built. He had 3 campuses that were very much at their beginning, Irvine and San Diego and Santa Cruz. And in many ways, the photographs he made sort of hearkened to new topographics, a movement that followed Ansel Adams' work in terms of its abstract use of built space to create art. Well, I wanted to know, how did Adams see the university? How did he use his camera to record this moment in time? Physically, intellectually, and emotionally. In fact, he told us very specifically at the back of the book, the final page, if you get there, you'll find a formula. You too could do this project. All you would need is to employ this list of cameras and equipment. And I thought, well, maybe you might not be familiar since most of you photograph with your cell phone. This would be new information. So I thought I would illustrate just how complex his photographic process was. So here he is with his camera, and that's just his 4x5 gear, and his 8x10 gear, and his 5x7, and his reducing back, and his Polaroid back, and his lights meter, and his film, and his film holders, and his film holders for processing film, and the chemicals for processing film. And majority of his photographs are actually made with a Hasselblad. And he had maybe 6 or 7 lenses, including a very specialized wide-angle lens and 5 backs to show the constant use of changing of the film. And he did lighting. He likes to think, he says often it's all available light, but the more you look at the photographs, the more you realize the impossibility of that reality. And even though he himself sees himself as a straight photographer, indeed he was quite adept at manipulating the scene. But all the magic happened in his darkroom. This is where he really brought to bear his intense understanding of the chemistry of photography in relationship to the light. And this is the gift he gave all photographers and stuff we're still using in Photoshop today. When we change curves, when we lighten and darken things arbitrarily, we are employing ideas and nomenclature that he set up in the zone system. But it isn't just the gearhead that he was. It is also his understanding of how to frame a photograph to its most complex level. A lot of what we look at in the architecture has its moment in time, the 60s, and the photographic sensibility, the language he employed wasn't different. He too had a style that he was really at the beginning of, setting up things like a picture within a picture within a picture, so that your eye ricochets around, landing on different elements. Always a person for scale, to show there is, but never an accidental moment. And as with all language, there's meaning. It isn't just design. There is an element of power, and there's an element of being a cog in a wheel. There's a way in which he sets up a conversation. I couldn't resist adding one of CED. Here are students who are busily working on the problems of the Mission District, which if they'd just known about food trucks, they could have had them all solved, right? So they have students working away, but I loved at this moment when I saw the back of the photograph, you'll see each head is perfectly placed. And I can only imagine the degree of orchestration that went into Ansel Adams' effort to make a real photograph. Have you ever seen the CED look like this? With everyone in their place and a place for everything. So Ansel Adams used composition, he used his wide-angle lenses, he used his ability to understand light to paint these very stylized and quite controlled images of the university. He knew this was an honor student. She wasn't just bounding down the stairs when he happened by. Who knows the degree of complexity that went into making this very simple picture you may not have even noticed. But this one may have caught your eye. There are many like this, and where there's a moment of film noir that he may not have intended, where there's some strange psychological event happening here. But again, the lighting draws your attention to the background and the foreground. Ansel Adams was very much a straight photographer. It was a term that he coined in the F-64 group in 1933 when he had his first exhibition with Imogen Cunningham and Edward Weston and a few others, who established a new way of using the camera, maximum depth of field, everything in sharp, that the medium had to be really celebrated as opposed to being obscured with a painterly abstract approach that was known as pictorialism in the era. So he goes into photography with the idea that the camera doesn't lie, it's the truth, and yet in his hands, he's busy, very busy, telling the story he wants you to hear. So how he structures his scenes, and particularly in this photograph, really is so blatantly obscure. I mean, it's a library. Where's the desk? They're lingering on the edge of a stairwell, balanced precariously with a book, and a few other books have been brought in on a cart, obviously from deep in the recesses, not books that you would normally see on a shelf. And, so that he could set up this perspective where you walk in and there's a middle ground, a beginning, a middle and an end, the trees outside the window. So as he structured these scenarios to give you an ambiance of the palace of knowledge, he actually confessed in an audio interview online that he thought this might have been a bit contrived. And I found this one also, and I glanced at it initially and just didn't think too much. It was, famous guy, famous thing, but start looking at the background and think about how Ansel Adams photographed the university, one of its most famous inventions, outside with some books underneath it in order to elevate it and to create that sense of drama. And so looking back again at what you initially see and just kind of pulling the curtain back for a minute to see how he actually constructed this image. with his assistant. He, throughout the book, created a point of view that one would have to almost say is godlike. He has an aerial perspective quite often employed in many of the images. So hires a plane or gets up high and uses a telephoto lens or creates this sort of ungrounded, all-seeing, all-knowing perspective. It's a perspective that you see in the sequencing at the very beginning of the book, which is another element of design that he employs. He starts off with a picture from the Lick Observatory of the stars, and he sets it up with the university is set up as a universe of students, page 2, who are all represented as multi-dimensional model illustrating the population dynamics. So we have a beginning of the book which says we are everything, and we are also science, and how yet we are in it together, and the individual is not necessarily being highlighted, except if you had a Nobel Prize. The issues of the day, as pointed out, were everywhere. But in the book, we only get a nod in this incredibly tightly composed, contained view of protesters who still look pretty clean and tidy. And so he did get one in. There may be one or two more. And also at the very end of the book, community service is acknowledged, which is just really taking off. And if you read everything Nancy Newhall lists of all the community service projects that were going on at that moment in time, you could have made a whole nother book the size of Fiat Lux, just illustrating the amount of work students were starting to do. And it was really what I see as the future of the university at that moment forward. So how did he see the university? He actually tells you how he sees the university. The general approach was intentionally forthright. The character of subject did not favor highly stylized or forced images. The complex character of the university, its environment, and its people demanded a certain emphasis on reality. I have to wonder about the word reality. We now have a very democratic sense of what the image is. It's color, it's online, it's quick, there are a lot of them. But when you look at the work of Adams, it was highly stylized and directed and contrived, and this was the mode of the day. He used his technical and aesthetic training to create a beautiful, hopeful yearbook for the university at a time of optimism that he actually noted was definitely being challenged by new voices, including Ronald Reagan and the Regents. The book barely got published. It was, the funding was under question, and at the end he was lamenting that, yes, indeed, he managed to get it done, but it was only because a few people showed up. The actual project, they were paid $75,000 for their 3 years of work, which, if you look at that money in today's economy, would be $550,000. So the two artists for 3 years photographed all over the entire university system. Today we crowdsource. We are asking the students with this project to go out and take pictures of the university and turn them in for competitions. I went on Flickr to see how many pictures are posted under the title University of California. 122,000 pictures have been posted since Flickr went up. That's, a few more years than Ansel Adams had, but people are busy. The question, though, is how do we make sense of all these photographs? Who edits? Who organizes? Who codifies and writes about and analyzes this photographic mess that we have now? And really, how do you see the university in relationship to how Ansel Adams saw us then? How did he see us? Well, I thought about it, and I actually taught a class at the millennium when everybody was high on the year 2000 and the university was in a massive building campaign. I taught a class in documentary photography with the idea that we would photograph the university. So in the spring of 2002, this class studied the university, went to the Bancroft Library, looked at the history photographs, and ultimately Had guest speaker from the planning department who came in and discussed the future of the plant. And then ultimately the work was shown at the Bancroft Library. I went back a week ago, 10 years later, to see this project, and amazed at how much had already changed. We had shot all in film in this space right here where the darkroom had been. People labored hours in the darkroom to create those images, all black and white, many using view cameras, and became quite deep into their process because of the time and the level of commitment that it took to make a photograph in that context. But there's already been a big transformation. Just looking at one auditorium, this is one project that a student did of work inside and then with the students in place. So I was going to bring more projects in, but I think my time is probably finished now. But I think you will have, hopefully, with the advent of the technology that allows us all to take pictures so quickly, stop and think about the time that has been invested in the photographic process and try to consider the implications that that time brings to the understanding of imagery. More does not necessarily always render clarity. I was skeptical of Ansel Adams when I first met him, and I rejected his work wholeheartedly for many years. I felt that he was a magician, that his work was irrelevant and way too beautiful. Now I would say that I have had a chance to reconsider him and to understand the virtuosity of his work and his absolute technical and skill and the emotions that he brought to it. I don't think he was probably a bit of a nerd, as we would define him, and so I don't think while he was funny, I don't think he was a warm, necessarily individual kind of guy, but I think ultimately, in spite of this picture that might say otherwise, his heart was in the right place, and he created a book that we now are able to use to revisit the past. So, thank you very much.
I want to start by thanking Michael for organizing this event, and also thanking Sam and Janet for the presentations that anchor this evening's discussion. I also want to take the opportunity to acknowledge someone who is now in the room, Catherine Cole, my dear friend and colleague, professor in the Department of Theatre, Dance and Performance Studies. And it's really Catherine who acquainted many of us with this quite incredible work by Ansel Adams, and then got Cal to think about using this work to get us quite literally on the same page. And I remember listening to Catherine at the height of the mobilizations around public education a few years ago, when we felt as if we were in the depths of despair, and that all we were doing was responding to the next crisis and the next darn budget cut. And she wanted to find a way of bringing together faculty, students, staff, alumni, those who are friends of the University of California, to not just respond to an immediate crisis, but to be able to envision futures and alternative futures. And when she first showed us these photographs, they were a way of thinking about the past, to think about futures, and also to think about a very particular project that created an imagination of the UC system, and to reflect, therefore, on what that may mean for us then. And Catherine urged us to read Ansel Adams' photographs in conjunction with another text from that time, which was Clark Kerr's Uses of the University, that laid out a very ambitious vision for the UC as what Clark Kerr called a multiversity. And of course, as you've heard, Ansel Adams was commissioned to do this work by Clark Kerr. So this particular project for me is an important one because it allows us to remind ourselves of why we belong to this great public university, but also what this university, in fact, means for the state of California. As Michael said in his introduction, the stunning achievement that is the University of California. So with that, I'd like to ask Marlo, Andy, and Kristina to start us off by reflecting a bit on what these photographs and what this project perhaps means to them in any way that you find useful. And that may involve reflecting or even disagreeing with what Sam and Janet have said or not. So, Marlo.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. When I look at the photographs, and certainly I should give you some history here, I also was an undergraduate at Berkeley and got my master's from DCRP, so now I'm back as a professor, so I have some perspective. But looking at the photographs, you're reminded of how, at the time, at least with those photos, I know it's just a point in time, how homogenous everything was and how peaceful it seemed, even though it was 1968, with so much uprising and so many protests going on and so many social movements that were happening on so many fronts. And so I think about the university today and think about the complexity and how much our students are out all over the world and how much our research is cutting across so many disciplines. And so when I look at these photographs, I really think about, although it's just a point in time, how much the university has evolved in terms of our research, the role of a university, right? So we can get into that later, but what is the role of a public institution? And I think with the photographs, they just seem very sterile at times. And certainly some of them, the natural beauty was great, but certainly looking at some of the photos of UCLA or even Berkeley for that matter, it just seems like so much is lost, so much of the story is not being told. And so that's what I walk away with.
All right, it says 10 inches from my mouth. That's probably it. I was thinking about this. I come to the university. Sometimes I'll go for long walks, and I don't know where I'm going to go. I set out from my home, and I often wind up at the university, and I'm not sure why. And I think, why am I going to the university? I'm here 5 days a week, lots of hours, and I end up here anyway. And it makes me think about the public nature of the university, that there are, on weekends, all sorts of people here who are not here during the week. And the last time I did this, I was with my son who's 4, and when you're 4, you're this far off the ground and you see different things. And he was looking down at the pavement, and there's a section of pavement just outside of Wurster Hall that the boundary of it is brick. I guess it's brick paving infilled with pebble dash concrete. And he said, "Daddy, why is this different from the rest?" And I looked down at it, and of course I had seen it 1,000 times, and you have different paving schemes on the campus, but this was a moment of elevated pavement. And I couldn't quite answer his question, but it made me think about the ways in which the university bounds itself off spatially in terms of its body language from the rest of the world and becomes a kind of idealized space. And then I thought, all right, so the space is idealized, the buildings are different, the fabric, the grain of the university is different from everything around it. But it's temporally different too. We have a different schedule. We have classes that start at different times and end at different times. The campanile strikes an hourly note, to be sure. It's a sensual interjection into the otherworldly time of the university. So the two great axes of human consciousness, space and time, converge at the university in a different form than they converge in the regular world. And I began to reflect upon that aspect of the university, which is an idealized community, and how the photographs in that book are very much part of that idealized community. But so is our built environment. And I think I'd like, if we could, to talk a little bit about the nature of that ideal and how it's changed and what that might be in the future and how it might take shape physically as well as conceptually.
Kristina?
I was struck looking at the, I have a very short experience with the University of California system, 3 months, I think. But it's not that different from a lot of other universities in terms of the crises that have occurred, although it's been often the symbol or poster child for some of the cultural conflicts of the last 50 years. But I was struck looking at the book. First, I admit I was kind of turned off by the aesthetic of the book and the whole project. And then I realized, looking at it and having a conversation with Janet before this panel, that the fascination with the machine, both Ansel Adams' fascination with the technical aspects of photography and the ability of the camera as a machine to be superior to the eye, to see so much more detail than the eye does in a way that's static and possible to control, especially after the capturing of the light on the film and to edit. It occurred to me that the machine and framing are two really significant themes. And I think they're significant at this point in time and also in a longer time trajectory. And I wanted to give a little bit of a time context for the significance of our ambitions and our conflicts about the machine and framing. 100 years before Fiat Lux was published in '67, Karl Marx published Das Kapital. And his ruminations and theories about industry and what was going to happen were in a lot of ways prescient about what did happen with industry and a relationship to capital, to the way that capital was centralized, and the implications of that for the ability to build a system like this, like the University of California. We needed some kind of centralized capital to be able to do that, and Clark Kerr, in his uses of the university, refers to the university as something which has supported industrialization, productivity in the state of California. He makes it very clear that it's an industrial agenda, and talks about the connection of the university to America's military and scientific supremacy. It's a very clear statement. It's not pussyfooted around at all. And at the very same time, the protests on campus in '64, Mario Savio was talking about people exhorting students to throw their bodies on the machine, on the gears of the machine, and stop it from functioning. So it's not just a metaphor. People understood this as a reality, that we in the university are participating in industrialization and leading industrialization, participating in the direction of capital accumulation and how that all worked, and what the implications were socially as well as intellectually. 100 years before today, Rosa Luxemburg published a book about the accumulation of capital, and she introduced the idea of the flow of capital. I think that's interesting because when Clark Kerr used the metaphor of, in a sense, an industry or a factory for the university, a kind of factory for knowledge, in the ideas of George Lakoff, one of our colleagues, when you choose a frame, it's a double-edged sword. Choosing the factory and industrial metaphors as a frame allowed him to connect to the industrial worldview and to attract money and support to the university. But when factories left town, what are you left with when you have an expensive facility and people who are the titans of American industry today are not factory people? They're people who run hedge funds, small businesses, who are attracting billions and trillions of dollars in investment in today's economy. So we've moved from a world where the accumulation of capital resulted in facilities that were involved in production, and that was the link to the university's metaphor as a kind of factory for knowledge, to a world in which the flow of capital, Rosa Luxemburg's idea, is our current reality, and what's valued by people in the private sector who make investments is nimbleness, flexibility, the ability to shift in what you do very quickly. And the university is still organized more in the model of the factory and less in the model of the hedge fund. There are models for learning where there is a lot more flexibility. Maybe some of you have heard of what was called the Irish Hedge School in the 18th century, where when Catholics were not allowed to teach because of the penal laws under the British rule in Ireland, they set up schools literally in hedges, around hedges, because it was illegal. They would be sent to Barbados, which doesn't sound so bad now, but apparently in the 18th century it was really awful. If you were a Catholic caught teaching students, you'd be sent to Barbados. And there was a model for how to teach in a more decentralized way. Clark Kerr in 2000 in an interview talked about the potential for distance learning. And he said, as I understand the quote, that he thought it had a lot of potential, but only if the system kept the physical interaction, in-person interaction of the campuses also, and added distance learning, rather than replaced the facility with distance learning. But I think that if we choose a frame today of the factory, we can't speak to the investors who we would need support from in the state of California. We need to choose our frame carefully for what the future is going to be, and I would choose the idea of the flows. I'd change out Fiat Lux for the Greek phrase panta re, which is everything flows. And I think that would be a different way for us to structure our activities, to structure the agenda for the school, and to connect to an industrial frame for our era.
So I want to build on that point to pose a question to all of our panelists. You don't all have to answer it, but it's a rather straightforward one, which is, how do we frame our understanding today of something called the public university? And in particular, how do we think about the University of California as an interconnected system as we think about the public university? And to me, what's really striking about Clark Kerr's work is that he gives us that theory of the university as a factory, the university as this machinery which one sees in Ansel Adams' photographs, but he doesn't, I believe, give us a theory of the public university. It's a theory of the multiversity. But what I'd love to hear from you about is precisely how we think today about the public university, the University of California in particular, and whether or not, as Kristina has suggested, we need a different frame and framing.
I'll start with the issue of what the public, well, two things. You have to remember that we were an agricultural land grant college. I mean, the whole reason for our early existence was agriculture and industry. And in this period of growth after World War II, it really was about expansion, and so that's why that frame seemed appropriate, and I think that's why it was represented the way it was. Now, we could say that a public university should be free to the citizens. I mean, that was the model, at least when I was coming through as a student, and actually till relatively recently, that's no longer possible, or likely, because there are too many other agendas for a limited amount of resources. People have, there's more entitlements. Free education was an entitlement, it's less so now. There's many other competing ones. So I think that the answer to Ananya's question is, well, if it's not free, how is it different from any other public institution? And my view is that because it still has a responsibility to the citizens to deal with the problems of the citizenry of the state. What are the underlying problems? And are they social? Are they economic? Are they industrial? How do we help? That's the mission. The mission is to reflect the needs, to help and to reflect and then help deal with the needs of the state, or the citizens of the state, and in a larger sense than the world. Not everybody has that mission, and I think that's a really sacred mission. And regardless of how much one pays to have to come here, I think that's what distinguishes it.
Could I offer something quick? There is free public education, and it's available online, and Berkeley has joined the group of MIT and Harvard, which are not public institutions, but are offering free online courses. Some of the most popular courses at the university are being offered free online.
Without credit.
Without credit. But the question is, it's like, having lived in Seattle for 10 years, the model for industrial success in Seattle was Bill Gates in his garage with no college education. So it was a question of performance. What could you do?
He went to Harvard for a couple of years.
But he didn't do the engineering track. He didn't do the computer science thing. He didn't feel he needed to have a PhD to start a company. Steve Jobs. And that model is a model that's embedded in our current economy, that it's about performance and not about credentials. So I think we're going to see a shift in how the public education, free education changes, and I think we're going to see a move directly towards a much more decentralized distance learning, online education approach. We're seeing it now. In K through 12, we're seeing it. Of course we're going to see it at the university. So what will the facilities become? Are we going to see an era of reuse of public university sites? Are we seeing an era of reuse of military bases? We're going to see some campuses reused for other things because People are now getting education someplace else, retirement homes for the students and faculty, because the value of in-person interaction is not sufficiently understood and quantified. It's a privilege. And I think we're going to see an era in which that privilege is appreciated much more by a small number of people. The money that you end up owing from paying for your tuition is a big deal. How many students out here agree with me? The debt you graduate with is a big deal. And if there was a way to get a free education and be judged on performance, I think a lot of people would choose it.
Before you jump in, I just want to point out that if you read the Steve Jobs biography, regardless of his particular leadership, that is a collaborative institution. They meet there, they interact, and they're at a place. They're not doing it online. So it doesn't mean necessarily that we need to abandon collaborative in-person.
No, but the definition of the facilities, the way we occupy university facilities is going to radically change. It's happening already. It's going to happen more.
Well, I hope you're wrong, because I think online education is a big mistake. I think there's some value there, but at the end of the day, it's about interaction. It's about creativity. It's about people learning from each other. Perfect example, I'm now a resident faculty member at Clark Kerr. So Berkeley now realized that we need to have faculty within the residence halls. So I now live among 900 freshmen and transfer students. And I can tell you, at first, my wife thought it was great. She was like, this will be wonderful, we can interact. And I was a little bit fearful. But as I've started to interact with them, so much of their learning happens in the dining hall. So much of their learning happens staying up late at night, interacting with one another. Not so much with me. They just ask me for all the nuts and bolts. When is Telebears? How can I get this class? But at the end of the day, if you talk to people who are very creative, right? Like Silicon Valley for a reason. People pay top dollars to be at certain universities. Having got my doctorate from MIT, when I first got there in 1999, we all thought that online education was going to be this great thing, and in fact, it hasn't been. And one of the reasons why it hasn't been is because there's value to interacting with one another. There's things you learn by being in the same space. And so if we think about public universities and what the future is, if we start to go towards that model, then we're doomed. I think the University of California is doomed. But fortunately, if you look at markets, you see that people are willing to pay top dollars still to come here. And why is that? Well, there's something about Berkeley's gravitas. There's something about being here. There's something about the different departments, the history, as Sam went through earlier. And Melvin Weber spoke, I think it was 1999, he was the CED commencement speaker, and he said, there's something in the Berkeley water. He goes, what is it? You can't measure it. And just like Kristina she was saying, you can't measure this, but everyone knows it exists, right? It exists. And because you can't measure creativity, you can't measure ideas. I mean, you try to through patents and all those other things. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of value for being there. So unless employers are willing to start hiring people and we start to make these online classes give actually people credit for this, I really don't see it taking off. And I think the University of California would be doomed if we go that route. And then I'll say something else with that, but I'll leave it there.
Okay. Andrew, do you want to say anything?
I'll pass. I have a lot to say, but
All right.
It looks like you have other things.
Well, I'm going to build on this question and this point to pose another round of questions, which goes back to Ansel Adams and the Fiat Lux project, which is that clearly Clark Kerr commissioned Ansel Adams to make a case for the University of California and its contributions, present and future, to the state of California. And in making that case, as Janet pointed out in her presentations, Ansel Adams does all sorts of interesting things. It's clearly a work for hire. So I wanted to hear from some of you about what that means, also in relation to our disciplines and professions, where the concept of the work for hire is present and problematic. But he also, as Janet pointed out, presents this very neat and tidy picture, a point that Marlo also made. Everyone's in their place at a time when everyone were clearly not in their place. And what that then may mean, because he doesn't give us a sense of these intense interactions that we know are crucial to university life. As a teacher, I'm really struck by how what's missing in those photographs is the classroom.
There isn't a single picture of a lecture
Right?
hall.
There isn't, with students actually in it. And so the case that he makes for the public university is all about scientific discovery, It's scenes like the library scene. It's sort of that sense of the university as a universe. How do we think about that? And what was it simply the sort of photographer Adams was? Was it simply that this was a work for hire? Or was there a very specific case for the public university being made at a specific historical moment that may tell us something about the case we now make or need to make?
I would like to, I would rely on Janet's response, but I think a different photographer given this commission would be very different. I think he was a control freak. And I think that you don't do a classroom because you can't organize 300 people and where they're going to sit and keep them from moving. And,
Last two pictures.
yeah, so I mean, I just think that he wanted to create the picture. And the fact of the matter is, one of the great things about the university, which does not come across, is that's messy. It's a messy place. As you said, I mean, people weren't in their right place. They were, in Sproul Plaza when they should have been in class or, whatever. And he probably couldn't tolerate that. And so this is what he could do.
Well, I don't know whether he could tolerate it or not. He was actually very liberal. But if you look at the 60s, there were such a them and us. There were, it was such a very absolute psychological divide. And he was working for the man. And he couldn't really do much more than the picture of the demonstration. I think you're right about the control and the kinds of images he made, but he was a work for hire. I mean, he was a radical in his own right. He did a lot of amazing things, like the advertisement for the Datsun and the coffee can with the picture of the mountain, of Yosemite on it to try to promote environmentalism in different ways. But in fact, under this particular construct, he had to make, people still dressed in 1962 nicely, expected to go out with their best face forward. And that book was, and made the effort to do that. Now, it didn't tell the truth. It told what, any more than an annual report tells the truth. What's the truth? That's another question. Can photographs get near the truth? I didn't even go down that road.
I just wanted to say about the framing of the people. I think it's very interesting how Ansel Adams photographed the people. They are all framed. No one exists without a backdrop or a foreground that puts them in either a box or a circle, or puts them in very clearly in the middle ground, attached to a machine, or being scanned by a machine, or irradiated by a machine. The monkey with the, the neck collar on. Everything is in a frame. And while we talk about the value of in-person interactions, I think that in that era, people saw the institution of the university as supporting you. It was helping you make your way. Mm-hmm. It was like walking up a staircase. When you came to the university, you were moving on up. You came for a structured experience that provided you with a structured niche in society. And when we interact at the university, I went to Harvard. The reason people go in person is to meet the other people who are rich and who are going to get them somewhere in their life. Not in as structured a way as I think those photographs imply, like each of us has a little box we're going to fit into, but you go to meet those people so you can climb the ladder. So you will have a funder for an idea you have. You don't come from a rich family, but your roommate does. That's why they go. That's why they pay that money, or actually in their case, have it paid for them by the endowment. But that's what's happening at universities. It's not just this purity of discussion, it's the social networking, the social capital that is built in an interaction.
You get so cynical.
I'm not cynical. I'm just a practical person who's looking at what's happening.
I just want to point out one other thing. By 1968, when this book was published, I never knew anybody that looked anything like the people in that book.
Yeah. It was a tumultuous time.
All right, Andy, the historian.
I don't know. I think sure, you say you're just looking, but I think you're looking with one eye. So when I went to Princeton for grad school, there were these extraordinary op-eds by undergrads in the newspaper for the school that denigrated the grad students for their ridiculous commitment of their lives to ideas rather than to Arthur Anderson and lots of money. And they would talk about the grad students as if they were subhuman misanthropes. And so there is the undergrad social climbing, networking thing that happens, but then there's this whole other thing that happens that has nothing to do with money. I didn't go to Princeton to meet rich people, and I doubt many people come to Berkeley to do that at the graduate level or the undergraduate level, but we have incredible education. So I think it's way more complicated than that. But I was getting back to Ananya's question, and also to Janet's presentation. He's a landscape photographer, perhaps first and foremost, and if we think of the book as a landscape, and all of these as landscapes that mix sometimes with still life, then we're getting closer to understanding what he's after. And to that end, he's aestheticized the university, and that's what he does. That's what they knew he'd do. That's what they pay him big bucks to do, right? It's a beautiful aesthetic object. The university looks beautiful in its frozen still lifeness. But this made me think how, that's what we're all reacting and chafing against. We don't like that. That's not what the university is, as Sam so ably put it. It's messy. This made me think then, if you can follow my thought process, about when the shit hit the fan with the budget crisis and everybody started going to Sproul Plaza to protest. And I didn't have to, I chose to address it with my students. And they wanted to know what my thoughts on this were. Is the university going to end? Where is the future of it? And I said, at least for me, I'm a humanist. I don't require equipment. All I need is a room and a slide projector and you and a book and me, and that's all we need. I close the door and I'm happy. We're happy. The quality of the education doesn't decline one iota as long as we have that set up. So the space, the image, the human beings in a space, that's all we need, really, for my part of the university. Other parts of the university are more complicated, obviously, but my part is in some ways insulated from that. We could do that in a garage, in fact.
So my next question has to do with something that perhaps Ansel Adams tried to do and may have achieved, but that also speaks to the interest that I know some of you have, which is to create a sense of the university as an unbounded entity, that the public university, and this came up, I think, initially in the comments that Marlo and Andy made, that how we think about the public university not simply as its own enclosed world of ideas and practices and even interactions, but it's an unbounded space. And Janet had one photograph from the Adams collection that I really love of the students serving as tutors. This was, I think, at UCLA. And of course, there was so much more of it happening, as you point out, and there's so much more happening now. So Marlo, since this is some of the work you do, to think about both universities as powerful actors, economic actors, but also to think about the relationship between the university and communities. How do we think about the public university as unbounded, either in Ansel Adams' times or now?
Right. Well, that's an excellent question, and it goes back to your last question about the role of a public university. I think the role of a great public university is one that actually is accountable to its people. So when you think about being in California, there are so many complex problems, from poverty to inequality to all kinds of issues around climate change, transportation. And you saw the photos that Ansel Adams had of the freeways in Los Angeles. But the public university really is unbounded. It's about reaching out across different classes, across racial and ethnic groups. And I think that's the real challenge as we go forward. If you look at this past election, we see it's a very different demographic across the United States. Yet when we look at our universities, especially the University of California, it doesn't reflect that change, right? And so as we go forward, there's so many opportunities to really branch out into various communities. There are all types of communities across California and then, of course, around the world, but I won't complicate things now. We'll just stick here in California. But the real issue is, as we go forward and with budget cuts and resources being constrained, how do we be inclusive? How do we educate those people who are part of California? How do we still be a part of the economy and contribute? I think that's our big challenge. And in Ansel Adams' photos, he shows this great, these great universities, these big buildings, and so forth. But what's really lacking is the complexity with the university-community relationships, what was happening at the time, as I said before, and others have said. And so as we go forward, we really have to think about that, as what does a great university, a great public university look like?
All right. So we've just had an election, and it's clear that that for the moment we have a Band-Aid solution called Proposition 30, though we were very thrilled that it passed. Is this again a new moment in thinking about the public university? Has the state of California turned a corner? Is the tax revolt that started with Prop 13 beginning to end? Or in fact, are we in a different era of knowledge production, as partly Kristina is suggesting, but also perhaps a different era of thinking about the financing of public universities, which again then requires us to make a new case for our existence and our future?
I'd like to take the optimistic view,
Yes.
but
Michael, I think, has insisted we take an optimistic
right.
view.
Now I'm going to try it, other than that one op-ed piece that kind of described how Prop 30 was already spent. We'd never see any of it. But I won't quote that one.
And that was partly research done by some of our doctoral students. Yes.
So here we are, and I think we are, we are the people. I mean, we should be able to, we signified with the election some ability to make change. And rather than just receiving all of this, it's really about going out and being more politically active as students and faculty and having the voice to raise up, to demand it. I mean, I really was so inspired by the Fiat Lux, even though I went at it expecting to hate it. But I had this moment of like, wow, look at how exciting it all is. Look at what they were doing with the money. They were building universities, and education was happening in a way that we don't experience it now. So can we go back to a version of it, partly physical, but as much conceptual? Right? And I think your points are very well made, that the dogma doesn't have to be maintained forever in terms of how we learn. We're going to be a mix of online. We won't stop that. And yet the FaceTime has to happen. So it's going to be a complex weaving together as the university moves forward. The money has to be allocated to the resource, that's all.
I would say both and.
Yeah.
I think that there is a recognition that we've drifted too far from the educational mission, particularly the universities, the full tier of universities that Kerr had envisioned, and I think people are worried about that. And while this may indeed be a Band-Aid, we're told now by 2014 there may actually be a surplus. But I don't think there's completely going back, because I think what happened in the 60s when we had this massive growth is with the growth came incredible inefficiencies. And I think we're under much more scrutiny now to be better at managing ourselves. I don't think we can escape that. I don't think we're always going to get funded blindly, in a sense, like the way we once were. So we do have a responsibility, and it will change. That responsibility will change how we act and what we do in some ways. I can't anticipate them all, but I'm sure that will happen. So I think it's both and. I think we're given some time here by Prop 30 to reconsider how we can proceed, how we can be efficient and still serve the mission.
It seems like our only natural resource is knowledge, really, ultimately at this point in time. It is our thing that we export, that we can control, that we can manufacture, in essence, and so it is still, I think, the primary goal.
Along those lines, that means our resource never diminishes, right? As long as we have really high-quality faculty and really high-quality students. And to that end, it seems like there shouldn't be any sort of alignment between funding and imagination, so that scarcity shouldn't align with the meagerness of imagination to envision the university. We should have big thoughts whether we have no money or not. And that, in fact, lines up historically with how humans have operated. You look to the Depression or World War II, when there was very little money for planning. That's when plans were made and big projects were launched. And so I don't think Prop 30 should change anything. I think we should be thinking big at all times and acting however we can act with the resources we have.
I actually think that adaptability and adaptation are going to be the theme of the next 50, 100 years. And very rapidly, We're going to get used to the idea that we're in a different world in terms of funding and in terms of opportunities. And I don't think that's a negative dystopian view, actually. I think that's something it's good to be challenged to perform. And that's going to make us sharper. And we are going to lose some structure that we valued in the past. But there'll be new structure that emerges. What we have to do in our generation, I think, is plant the seeds of excellence in that model instead of acting as if we're the crop that's been harvested and now nothing is going to grow. We have to figure out how to encapsulate the best of our generation and pass it on, just as other generations tried to figure out what was the best of the 19th century university and try to pass that on. It doesn't mean the form will stay the same, and hopefully the price tag won't get any bigger. Hopefully the way we can approach this is that through the idea of performance and excellence and what it is we truly value. Just, just to remind everybody, as this whole process changes and we see more and more online teaching and learning, if I imagine myself coming from a working class community, having an opportunity to learn in my home or in the apartment that I had rented and not have to worry about what I'm wearing, not have to worry about how I speak, what my accent is, and being able to learn everything that I wanted to learn and try things, hack things, do some things that are different, believe things based on my cultural background, I actually think that sounds kind of preferable. And I can imagine people who would find that a much more comfortable way to engage in teaching and learning than having to show up physically in a room full of people who have different experiences in life than you have. That matters when you're actually going to be a leader of a group. You have to have those social skills and be able to work with lots of kinds of people. But it's a very painful process to move into the 1% after you've been outside that group and then try to go back to where you're from and make some change happen. There's a lot of social conflict in that process, and I think distance learning and online education will actually make it easier for some people who are out there, who are just as smart as everyone in this room, who don't have the opportunity, for whatever reason, to actually physically be here.
Well, I completely...
Sam and Marlo are on the edges of their seat, waiting.
Well, I completely agree that distance learning is absolutely appropriate for some folks, and coming to a campus is perfectly appropriate for others. I mean, the great thing about distance learning is it can reach people that not only don't have the resources to come, but just aren't in the proximity of a place to come. So there's no argument there. I think one interesting thing that you did mention about change is look at the last 4 buildings that have been built on this campus. The Lee Kai-shin Center, Citrus Building, Blum Center, and the other one that I forgot what they call it. These are all new combined disciplines that didn't exist 20, 30 years ago.
And private philanthropy.
And private philanthropy. But the issue is that they have reconstructed, reimagined themselves in these new places. So I think that's a very optimistic viewpoint about that we may be an ocean liner that doesn't, we can't really move with the winds. We can reorient ourselves over some period of time and make these kinds of changes that go forward.
Well, just 2 comments. One, back to distance learning. If you're wondering which direction it's going to go in, just ask your faculty members, would they allow their children to take an on-distance learning class versus going to Berkeley or Harvard or somewhere else? And I think overwhelmingly they'd say no. Because if you look, again, at the demographic changes in the United States and around the world, it really is, we live in a complex world. And just as Sam pointed out, which I think was a very good point, is that we're actually moving into a place where it's about interaction. It's about disciplines breaking down their barriers. Again, being at MIT now and Harvard have so many disciplines, or so many departments that have broken down now, their joint programs and so forth. You have Johns Hopkins doing work with universities around the world. You have Berkeley collaborating with people all around the world, and they actually make time to connect and interact with each other. So I think distance learning and online learning is just, in many ways, a utopian idea right now, unless you start to see the 1% send their children to these programs, which you don't see, right? And so, again, I go back to my point of being a resident faculty member at Clark Kerr, and almost all of my students, their parents are engineers or highly educated and so forth. Many come from Silicon Valley, and we're increasingly getting more and more students out of state. So Berkeley now, 24% of our freshman class is out-of-state residents. UCLA is about 30%, and San Diego's not too far behind. It's somewhere in the same neighborhood as those of Berkeley and UCLA. So in fact, you have people willing to pay out-of-state tuition to be here for a reason, because it is about interaction, it is about the social networks and so forth. But more importantly, as we move forward, we think about ourselves as a public institution. Well, what does that mean in terms of educating the population, right? So does the University of California actually have an obligation to educate just the residents of California, or should we set a certain side of slots for people who are out of state or from international students and so forth? These are big questions that we have to ask ourselves. If we decide to continue down the path that we are, to be an elite institution, well, there's a cost to be an elite institution, right? And that's something that we want both. We want to be an elite institution, and this is not coming from everyone who believes in a public university, but certainly the pushback that we're starting to see where people say, well, Berkeley should break away from the UC system and become its own university, or we should increasingly become more privatized. Well, what they're basically saying is, we will be an elite institution, and there's a cost to being an elite institution. I happen to believe that you could be a public university and keep high standards and be inclusive. And I just don't think pushing online distance learning, especially for those types of people or those people who would be more comfortable at home, is not the way to go. It's a very elitist attitude, and I don't think that's the way we should be thinking about public education.
So I know there's a lot to discuss here, but one closing thought before we open it up for questions, which Michael will moderate, which is at the height of, again, at the height of those mobilizations around public education, there was a great deal of pushback from folks in California, many of them in Southern California, saying, why are people at the University of California protesting? What are they protesting about? And some of the language used to critique our mobilizations around public education was that students in particular in public universities had become the new welfare dependents. Or as Republicans today would say, they had become the moochers. They had become the takers, not the makers, which, by the way, if you have heard the report on the GOP governors' convention that's taking place in Las Vegas as we speak, they have a diagnosis for what went wrong in the election. The country now has more takers than makers, right? And everyone who's a taker voted for Obama. But that language of dependent, of welfare dependency, of mooching, was so prominent in the ways in which the critics of those mobilizations presented their case against supporting the public university. And while I have all sorts of disagreements with Ansel Adams' book and with Clark Kerr's uses of the university, what strikes me is the case that they made for the contributions of the public university. And they did so boldly. They did it on terms that I continue to disagree with, perhaps, that it's precisely about the factory. But nevertheless, they made a bold case for this is what we do as a public university.
Special thanks to Catherine Cole for helping us and initiating this. Special thanks to the panel for being here, and special thanks to Ananya Roy for being a lively moderator in her own right. Reminder, I need to talk to the panelists before they leave. For the rest of you, bon voyage and Fiat Lux.